You're listening to the Be Better Off Show by Kelly+Partners.
Well, good morning and welcome back to the Be Better Off Show, where we bring you guests who will help you to be healthier, wealthier and wiser. And today I'm really pleased in from the US to have General Robert Spalding, the author of a book called Stealth War, How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept. I think that can be applied equally here in Australia, a long-term American ally. Welcome, General Spalding.
Thank you. Great to be here.
General, I'd love to start, as we always do, with your background. You grew up in the US and you've got this amazing academic and military background. Can you share with our listeners, where did you grow up and how were you educated and what brought you to the military?
So I grew up in California. My family was a farming family. I actually thought I was going to be a farmer and got my bachelor's degree in ag business, of course. During my senior year of college, I watched this movie called Top Gun, and I thought, wow, wouldn't it be nice to fly jets and chase girls and ride motorcycles? So I joined the Air Force, and one thing led to another. I ended up flying the B-2 and had an opportunity to go to China and live there for a couple of years with my family. So I went to the Defense Language Institute, and I studied at a university in Shanghai called Tongji University, and traveled the country, learned the language, the culture, the history, the geography of China over those 2 years, and really got to know and love the people of China, and really had a wonderful time with my family there. Coincidentally, that was a time of SARS. So we actually evacuated for a couple months for SARS during the summer of 2003. And that's going to come back and feature in future days, as we know. But, I went back to the Air Force, continued flying the B-2, but because of this experience, ended up being involved in a number of China policy-related jobs. So Office of Secretary of Defense, advising the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and then being the senior defense official and defense attache in Beijing, and finally culminating as a senior director of strategy at the White House, where I was the architect of the current national security strategy. So I've had, mostly a career flying B-2s, but really towards the latter end of my career, focused on this U.S.-China competition, and not the military aspects of it, but more in the economic, financial, industrial base, information, media, politics portion of it.
And so, General, when you're living in China in, I think it was 2001 to 2003, and you're learning the language and meeting the people, you shared that there's a saying of the 1,000 names or 1,000 names to describe the average Chinese person. Can you share with us your impression of the Chinese people and how you came to know them?
Yeah, the term you're looking for is Lao Xing, the old 100 names. And, the people were amazing. They were generous. They were for the most part, very friendly and welcoming. And, we felt very much at home living in China. In fact, I told my wife as we left in 2004 that, I wanted to come back and start a business in China, because it was really, a great place to be, and they treated us very, very well.
And so then during the subsequent 15 years as you came back to the US, what did you see change, or how did the information that you received start to inform you more as to what you believe has been happening?
So in 2013, the Air Force sent me to be a senior military fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City. And I spent 12 months there meeting financial and business leaders around the United States, and really getting to understand some of the challenges they were facing, and made a lot of great contacts. And I went from there to advise the chairman of the Joint Chiefs on China. And it was during that formative time around the fall of 2014 that one of those contacts that I had sent me a briefing, a presentation describing what I would characterize as attacks on U.S. companies that varied in terms of the tactics used, but they were all sponsored clearly by the state, and it really involved taking intellectual property or something of value from the company using what I would call state level tradecraft, espionage. And I was really shocked at the time, and I remember thinking, this was so beyond what I understood the world, what was going on in the world, and really not known to anybody within our government, that we began, and I had a team of China experts at the time that we started working on understanding what was going on, and the more we dug, the more we found. And even till today, I learn something every single day about the depth and breadth of infiltration that we have. And so, that's led to, a lot of the policy changes that's happened in the United States. Not many people know this, but, working in the Pentagon in 2014, was really where a lot of the changes that we see in our government began.
So what this particular paper you saw, General, where did it, was it written by an independent group, or was it observations of private citizens, or did it come out of a think tank? And what sort of, I guess, what did that lead you to do next?
Well, so it was actually created by one of the U.S. top auditing firms, and it had been presented to the National Security Council. Unfortunately, the way the business works today, most of the companies that were in that presentation had very strictly guarded what had happened to them. In fact, they hadn't come forward. Nobody knew about it. And when you look at the state of play of that at that time, most businesses weren't willing to come forward and talk about what had happened to them. So this was something, and the reason my book's called Stealth War is because most of these companies would not come forward because they were afraid that the Chinese Communist Party would come after them if they came out and talked about it. And so it was the presentation itself, was revealing information that even our own intelligence community didn't have. And the reason our own intelligence community didn't have it is because they're restricted by law from collecting information internal to the United States. And these were attacks that had occurred on U.S. soil. So, the National Security Council had received the briefing, and really the briefing had been unremarkable, but one of the things that I was able to recognize is the sophistication, as a B-2 pilot, of an air campaign, really combined with, my prior experience in New York and a PhD in economics, with the realization that here was a vector of attack that we, quite frankly, didn't understand and weren't prepared to deal with.
So, General, when you, with your background, and as you mentioned, you've got a PhD in economics, and you've been in the military, so it's an unusual combination of experience. And often in our society, people are very specialist in one area, so they don't join the dots. And I can see that now in the US, there's a more all of government response to the challenge, rather than everyone off doing their own thing. When you saw that, did you find that I guess the powers that be, the economic establishment, political establishment, etc., did they want to hear this story?
So I started briefing all the senior leaders in the military, so all the 4-stars, and I got 2 responses from the leaders in the military. One is, this is really, really bad. And the second is, it's not my job. And so what we did is we went from the Pentagon and started talking to Department of Justice, the FBI, Treasury, Commerce, U.S. Trade Representative, the State Department, really going around all of the interagency partners and saying, okay, it's clear the military doesn't view this as their job. Whose job is it? And after, about 6 to 9 months of going around all the agencies, what we found out was it really was nobody's job. And it was something that, quite frankly, nobody in the federal government was dealing with. So we focused on awareness, creating awareness. And in fact, we stood up in 2015 what's called the Office of Commercial and Economic Analysis. And today, it's grown from those initial days of 5 people in a $5 million budget to almost 50 people in almost a $50 million budget. And it's growing even from now. They've got more PhD economists than the U.S. Trade Representative today. And so what we realized at the time was that we needed to better understand what was going on, but more importantly, that there was no agency or department in the federal government that was focused on what I would call economic warfare.
And where, from a political perspective, was at that point 15, I guess the tail end of the Obama, or 14, 15, tail end of the Obama administration. There's a lot of talk about the undertakings that the Chinese had made not to militarize islands in the South China Sea in 2015. Was that president and that administration, I guess, engaged on the issue, or were people really blindsided?
No, I mean, the Obama administration behaved much like the Clinton administration, the George W. Bush administration, the George H.W. Bush administration, in that, there was no attempt at all to confront Chinese Communist Party behavior. In fact, there was every effort made to not confront them. And so, no, there was no chance, and today, looking at how far things have come, there is no way I could bring this to any political appointee in the Obama administration and have a fair hearing. In fact, when I objected to sharing peaceful civil nuclear reactor information with the Chinese, because I felt that the engineers that also worked on naval nuclear reactors that was creating a danger for the United States, I was literally, attacked by, a whole host of folks inside the National Security Council for that. So, it was a recognition by myself at the time that, pushing this, without an administration that was willing to confront the Chinese Communist Party was useless. And so what I told my team was, we need to think of a counter strategy. We need to really analyze this in anticipation that maybe, perhaps someday, there will be a political dynamic within the United States that will be willing to really hear the words, understand the implications of them, and then do something about it. And really, that's what happened in the course of from the time I left the Pentagon in the summer of 2016 to the spring of 2017. Literally, we had a sea change in politics in the United States, and so I was asked to come into the White House and help devise a counter strategy against China. And so, absent that, I quite frankly, I expected that the United States would fall further behind, and certainly that democratic societies around the world would find increasing pressure from the Chinese Communist Party, because quite frankly, societies really didn't understand what was going on.
So let me ask you, General, for our listeners, to explain, if you would explain how the Chinese system is structured. And I share so often with our business owners that structure is so important, that strategy is one thing, but it's really the structure of something that puts the rubber to the road. In China, we think of China as a country. I think certainly in Australia, look at it in the way that we look at our own country, as I think most people do when they look at things generally. But the Chinese Communist Party is structured in a different way, and that means that policing and the military and economics, the ownership of private interests, if you like, members of communist parties on boards, etc. And there's this Article 9 that I've heard you mention about, the Chinese Communist Party Constitution. I guess I want our listeners to know that I love Chinese people. We've got a lot of them as friends and clients and team members. But what is the Chinese Communist Party's MO, and how is China really structured?
Well, first of all, it's, I think the best way to describe the system in terms of if you're looking for a moniker would be as a fascist regime. And that's really, because the state owns the means of production. But I think the key innovation that the Chinese Communist Party, created, and this was really Deng Xiaoping, after the death of Mao Zedong, he started opening up the economy. He had this famous quote that it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. So very pragmatic point of view. But in reality, when you look at the system, it is very much like the Soviet system, except for a realization that the economic component of the Soviet system failed, and that's why the Soviet Union failed. And so the idea, really, the real nugget of brilliance is to align the private profit motive with the Chinese Communist Party interests. So allow people in China to get wealthy, but allow them to get wealthy in ways that promote the preservation of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, this is, free democracies, that had, capitalism and kind of free will, free choice, thought that they had the patent on this. But so the way they were able to align this was really not, a lot of people talk about market reforms in China. It's not about market reforms. What it is about is access to capital. And any businessman, any entrepreneur knows that access to capital is the most critical thing in ensuring a business is successful. And so what the Chinese Communist Party did, you mentioned the Constitution, since they have control of the police and the banks and the borders and the military, what they could do is essentially ensure the steady flow of capital to those winners that could then eventually become global champions. And by not just allowing them access to capital, but ensuring they had an uneven playing field in China and subsidizing them outside of China, that they could grow these very powerful companies that didn't play fair according to three concepts of free trade.
So that China's admitted to the World Trade Organization 2001. You've touched on there very quickly, but some of the things that the Chinese Communist Party have done to give their companies, I guess, an advantage. Can you share some of those that you've observed with our listeners?
Well, I didn't really know a lot about Australian industry, but what I did find out was the Australian rail car industry was essentially destroyed by China. Why, how, is very interesting, because in 2016, as I was, looking at this issue, they came into the United States and built 3 manufacturing facilities, brand new manufacturing facilities for rail cars. That was in an industry in the United States that was at the time at 50% capacity. So by leveraging access to capital and subsidizing industries, not only in China, but also abroad, they could go in and basically squeeze out the existing businesses. There's a lot of ways they do it. One is with non-tariff barriers in China. There's also subsidization of the companies. They get free electricity, for example. Some of their manufacturers, they get subsidized into other markets. In fact, microelectronics, there's a monopoly pricing scheme with regard to the components that are manufactured in the US and they're placed on PCBs in China. No Chinese company has to pay more than a fraction of the cost of a component for a PCB that a US manufacturer would pay. So there's all of these very systemic issues with regard to trade and economics. And then when you add in the fact that they've got a closed financial system where you have a non-convertible currency and strict capital controls, then you realize that they can perpetuate this imbalance of trade into perpetuity, because when you have a trade imbalance, you should have a corresponding currency trade that tends to equal the prices. But because they have a closed financial system, they can ensure that that doesn't happen. So there's all of the rules and the kind of the models that say how trade should work and how global economics should work. If you have a system where that's designed to essentially not follow those rules, then you essentially you create a permanent systemic advantage, and that's essentially what they've done, and they've done it to great effect.
And I guess a big part of that is to be able to control ultimately the wages that the majority of their workforce, you've got winners who are right up the top. So it's not traditional communism that everybody gets $1 each. And you've got hundreds of millions of workers whose wages, like the currency, aren't free floating, if you like. They don't, as prosperity increases, that doesn't necessarily trickle down anywhere near the cost of labor.
Well, and when I was in Shanghai in 2002 to 2004, you would have workers come in to receive their pay, and instead of getting paid, they'd have thugs meet them and beat them. So, you do not have the right as a worker in China to organize a union. So in terms of workers' rights, there are none. And really, so if you look at, what this looks like to a modern corporation like Apple, for example, they're able to accumulate, $260 billion in cash reserves, and they're doing that on the basis of essentially exploitation of labor, and then very, very low costs for environmental protections. And so it really was, and it is in China, and having lived there, I can attest to the fact that the rules don't really apply to you as long as you're doing things that promote things that the Chinese Communist Party wants. So you don't have to, necessarily, have a clean factory, or you can abuse your people. It's just as long as the Chinese Communist Party is not threatened by that. So that's the problem in that system. There is no rule of law per se, and there really is no human rights or civil liberties. And that really allows business there to be utterly ruthless, almost like if you look at it in the United States, the 50s, there's a lot of books written about, Steinbeck, Grapes of Wrath, the absolute abuse of people. And then you had people, later talking about environmental destruction. We went through that because we're a democracy. We had to reform. We had to create, labor laws. We had to create environmental protections. That does not exist. When I was living in China, my hair was falling out after the first year. I had spots on my hands. I was convinced that I was getting old prematurely. Within a year of returning to the United States, that had gone away. The land, the air, the water is so fundamentally polluted there. And that is because there's really no controls on how business is done.
So if business is done in the interests of the party, then it's okay. Would you be able to explain for us, General, essentially how you found, I think it was Article 9 you mentioned, and what impact that had on your perception of what was going on.
So, being an Air Force major, coming into Shanghai in 2002, I wanted to make extra sure that I didn't, essentially alarm the authorities there. So I made no effort to understand the government or the political system. I just lived there, went to school, met people, just tried to understand the Chinese people. I had really no concept of the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Party. When I got to the Pentagon in 2014, my job was to understand the government and really understand this competition. And as I started studying the Chinese Communist Party, the documents of the Chinese Communist Party, I really, there was a transformation in my point of view. And that is, the Chinese Communist Party does a wonderful job of obfuscating its nature by, essentially wrapping itself in the Chinese people. So I think everybody would agree that the Chinese people are, hardworking, diligent, friendly, some of the most incredible people in the world. And so what the Chinese Communist Party would do is essentially speak on behalf of this great, body of people. And when they do, they would invoke them if you criticize the party. And, I found it even in our own diplomatic speech. And so as I started reading the Chinese Communist Party Constitution and document number 9, and really in the party constitution, you look at that and you say, at the time, I had no idea that the People's Republic of China had a constitution, and yet there was also a party constitution, and that the sovereign was not the PRC, but rather the CCP. This is not something that's taught anywhere. And in fact, when you look at our China experts in the United States, because they knew that they had to self-censor in order to continue to receive visas to go to China, they wouldn't talk about the difference between the PRC and the CCP. And it really was, as I began to understand it, it was this shadow government that exists that runs the country, yet that, our government, for the most part, and the governments of most democratic nations, because they don't have two systems kind of operating at the same time, they were actually engaging not the sovereign of the country, but actually the executors of the sovereign. And that's very, very important. You have a State Department, you have a Ministry of Foreign Affairs in a democratic country, and then you go and meet the Minister of Foreign Affairs in China. That's not the guy that's making the decision. It's in all the main decisions about what's happening in China are made by the Chinese Communist Party.
And so to really understand that, who runs China?
It is the Chinese Communist Party. When you look at a sovereign, they control the banks, they control the police, they control the borders, and they control the military. If you control those things, then you're essentially the sovereign. In China, the Chinese Communist Party controls those things. In the United States, it is a three-part, government that shares power. That there is no, supreme, party or what have you above that, the executive, legislative, and judicial branch. It is, when Secretary Pompeo goes around the world and engages his counterparts, he's representing the United States, he's representing the American people. That's not the same when you have a PRC official abroad. The real power, and even when you go and you look at a province, for example, who wields power in a province? It's not the provincial governor, it's the head of the Chinese Communist Party in that province that wields power. We don't understand that system because it's a completely different way of organization.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And so when President Xi makes himself president for life, is that a turning point in the way that structure operates?
It goes counter to modern precedents. So Mao Zedong, of course, was the supreme leader in China, and then Deng Xiaoping comes in, and they get rid of the Gang of Four, and they create this shared power system because they recognize, and I think rightly so, that because the Communist Party controls everything, allowing somebody in the Communist Party to run everything is extremely dangerous. So what we want to do is share power within the party. And so they do that for Deng Xiaoping, then Jiang Zemin, and then Hu Jintao. And then, of course, Xi Jinping comes in. And there's this concern that corruption maybe is getting out of control. Bo Xilai and Zhou Yongkong are essentially collaborating to potentially swing the general secretary and the president of China to Bo Xilai's favor. And the party, kind of comes together and gives Xi Jinping power to really kind of reform things. The problem is that Xi Jinping, and by the way, the reason they do this is because Xi Jinping is probably more communist than any leader, prior to, I guess Mao Zedong. But then he goes too far. He goes into the 19th Party Congress, and he arranges it so he could be, essentially General Secretary and President for life. This is counter to precedents, and I think ensures that this, every 10-year peaceful transfer of power, it's been interrupted. Who knows what's going to come next? Nobody knows, because we still haven't seen in that precedence, just like Xi Jinping was brought forth 5 years prior to his, introduction as a new general secretary. There's nobody being brought forth. It is Xi Jinping. There is nobody else. So it's a very, very much a different system. And in addition, with that has come, and if you deal with that, what you realize is there's nobody wants to talk back. Nobody wants to put up any kind of alternative discussion. Nobody wants to tell the emperor he has no clothes. So now you get into this very, very dangerous situation where they were with Mao Zedong, that, it's really difficult to see what's going to happen.
And so without even considering the rest of the world, once that dynamic is created, there's no feedback loop, if you like, where they're planning an alternate viewpoint can be offered and necessarily heard. Everybody around that person is going to agree, because the cost of disagreeing in that structure's probably disappearing. So what does that mean for the world when you look today into, I wanted to come back to, you mentioned, I thought it was very, very interesting. You left the Pentagon in late 15?
16, late 16.
Late 16. And why did you leave the Pentagon? And was that before Trump was elected or after?
No, it was before. I was selected for 1 star, and then was sent to go be the defense attache and senior defense official in Beijing. I arrived there a week before they took the UUV in the South China Sea, negotiated return of that, and really was from December of 16 to May of 17, when I left to go to the White House. So it's a very short tenure that second time in China.
Okay, and we hear a lot about Trump, but I guess an observation from Australia is that if he hasn't done anything, he's certainly, with the team there, brought the China situation into sharp focus. I've heard you describe, you turn up and you're in the White House and you look to the pivot to Asia. We're here in Australia, we see a little bit of action in Darwin, including the Australian government selling the port to the Chinese, which is not that amusing. But what did you find? And then can you describe to us, I guess, what's it like to work in the White House, and what happened next, I guess, in your story?
So I get to the White House, and I've had now, almost 4 years of uninterrupted work just focusing on this competition. And so I was able to articulate the main challenges. The international systems no longer functioning to promote democratic principles or free trade or rule of law or human rights or civil liberties. And these are some of the things that we need to do to get back to it. Really, advance, economic development in the United States, manufacturing, infrastructure, STEM education, research and development, and then really begin to protect our institutions from, the incessant pilfering and other things that were going on. And so, what I met, when I got there were, essentially detailees that said things like, economic and security and national security have no relation. And of course, I just spent 4 years, pointing directly to the direct correlation between our economic security and our national security. So what I did was, at the National Security Council, bring experts in espionage and influence in lawfare, in all the ways that the Chinese Communist Party were conducting their stealth war campaign, and try to educate. And I did it from the perspective of a businessman. How does a businessman, deal with the Chinese Communist Party in the globalized internet connected world? And the answer is they don't. They essentially go along to get along. And that go along to get along is really, in the long term, is not the best interest of a firm in the West, because eventually their competitiveness will be eroded and they will find themselves essentially subsumed by their competitor in China. And that's not good for us. It's not good for Australia. It's not good for the United States. And so my goal, my entire role there was to both help structure the current national security strategy, but more importantly, educate my colleagues on this profound, training that I had undergone in the prior 4 years, and share with them what I had learned. I tried to, when I left China, it was May of 2017, I asked for a meeting with Liu He. Liu He's Xi Jinping's right-hand man, and I ended up meeting with his assistant, and I explained to him, I was going back to the White House. We were going to put a stop to this because we were on to them, and that the best way that they could, essentially ensure the preservation of the Chinese Communist Party, and more importantly, the continued vibrancy of the Chinese economy, was to think about what they were doing and try to figure out how they would go about reforming. And of course, it was needless to say, you see today that they have decided to go the other way.
And it looks like they've decided to go strongly in the other direction. So you get to the White House, you're pulling this information together, running a campaign of education. How is it that the US suddenly have a president that then takes what could be considered a more direct and confrontationalist approach? And how do you think that's going?
Well, I think what happens in DC is that a lot of times policy supersedes facts. Political prerogatives get in the way of information. And I think what was different about the current president is that he was willing to ask questions, and he was willing to challenge. And when, having, spent 27 years in national security, and a lot of it in the policymaking environment, what you realize is in many instances, facts aren't brought to the table. It's not about facts. It's more about politics. It's more about political expediency. And I think what the president, because of his outside nature, he's not been a politician. He hasn't been in DC. He would ask questions, and people would bring things to him. And a lot of times when everybody around the table is kind of nodding their head yes, nobody's asking those questions about, well, what about this and what about that? So when he would ask those questions, what about this and what about that? As you can imagine, the politicians in the room didn't have an answer. There's no answer because there was no facts to back it up. And so when he was brought facts about the nature of the Chinese Communist Party, the things that they were doing, then he reacted on those facts and made decisions on the basis of that. So, it really was a, as I was observing it, because in a lot of ways I was an observer of the process, my sense was we would bring policy decisions to the president that really weren't backed up. I knew myself they weren't backed up by facts. And then he could see through that and just ask questions. And I've experienced this before with other leaders. It's not just the president. I've found people come into a situation where they have really no prior training, but that almost gives them an advantage, because then they ask questions. Well, what about X? What about Y? What about Z? Yeah. And when you, especially as a businessman, what you find out very quickly is if the people can't answer the questions, then you have to really start to dig and try to get to the bottom of what's going on. And I think that's what he did. He made decisions, quite frankly, that no president in the last 8 administrations dared to do.
Yeah, and it does appear to be putting the Chinese Communist Party under a fair degree of pressure. How do you think they're going?
I think they're having a very difficult time of it, and that is to be, that is to be expected. I think so. This is what's happening, and this is where we're headed. We're headed into this bipolar world where they're going to bring into their orbit the ones they already have: Iran, Russia, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba. Of course, you know what those countries are, but then they're going to use the Belt and Road Initiative to bring in the developing countries of the world as much as they can. They're going to use that to influence the outcomes, the political outcomes in international institutions. And then I think what our national security strategy is really designed to do is say, what we are, what the United States government is doing is going to allies and partners and saying, you have to make a choice. It's either us or them. This is what's at stake. Democratic principles, rule of law, human rights, civil liberties, and free trade on our side, or you can have the exact opposite on their side. But you have to choose. No more can you have a security relationship with the United States and an economic, financial, and informational relationship with China. So that's what's happening. I think what you're going to see in the ensuing 10 or 15 years is, which system fares better, which system provides for its citizens better. I'm of the firm opinion that as we tighten our collective relationships with democracies, and we actually trade with each other in a fair and reciprocal way, and we take care of our people, and we provide for them, that the innovation, the economic vitality of that system will grow. And this is what happened during the Cold War. It becomes a beacon for the people living under the boot of a Chinese communist system. And unless you allow that to show forth, unless you allow that to flourish, in other words, if you allow an authoritarian regime to come into an open system where everybody's playing by the rules, and that one nation decides not to, then it pollutes the entire system. And so you get this false belief that authoritarianism or one-party rule is the best way to go. It's not. It's just because they've had the ability to take innovation, technology, talent, and capital from the free societies and use it in a zero-sum competition. And so that's what's happening now. That's why the decoupling is so important, vitally important. And it's really about showing the real benefit of capitalist democracy over one-party authoritarianism.
So we've got, if you look at DC today, there's a 3rd of November election. I guess 2 questions. How hard does Trump go between now and the 3rd? The polling's obviously very tight. And what does the current US posture towards China look like if there's a Biden victory?
Well, that's a very good question. I'm not sure what Biden's policy platform is. He hasn't been very explicit about that. I think what's clear that's happening in Washington, D.C. is it's a war between the establishment and, what could be loosely called Trumpism. But, because the president was elected by the American people, then it's more, you have to characterize it more. And this is what I said in my book. It's more about democracy kind of, shedding off the shackles of kind of the last 30 years and saying, this is not working out for us. We want something different. The people that were benefiting from that, primarily the wealthy and the politicians, don't like that. They want to continue to do things the way they're doing. So, I think there, come November, you're going to see either the establishment win, in which case it's going to be very, very bad for democratic systems, or you're going to see the American people say, once again, no, we don't want Joe Biden. Joe Biden's been there for how many decades, and really it's resulted in no different outcomes for the working class in America, or we want this other president. Now, I try very hard myself to be nonpartisan. I just try to look at the facts, where we're going. It's really about the Constitution and the preservation of our democratic republic. And I try very hard, but I cannot find, a whole lot of good in the political establishment, because they're the ones that enabled this relationship with the Chinese Communist Party to persist. And they did it while earning enormous sums, while at the same time presiding over the destruction of the industrial base and the working class of America. And I would venture to say that you can go to nearly every democracy today and you see the same exact thing. The only one being that's kind of outside that loop is the Germans, who've somehow been able to, be just as mercantilist as the Chinese in ways that, and maybe that's to their credit. But at the end of the day, that's what I think is going on here.
So we see, it does appear that in Australia and potentially even in the US, that there's almost I feel like a bipartisan acknowledgement of the Chinese challenge. Whether there's a bipartisan alignment on what to do about it, but it does appear, even down here in Australia, where at first, strongly held views about some of the misbehavior of the Chinese Communist Party was seen as quite radical. It does seem both sides of politics now have said quite strongly that interfering in our democracy in the ways that have been done is not on anymore. Is there any hope that in DC that there'll become a bipartisan position, or do you think that the Chinese tools of influence in terms of sponsoring special billionaires in Australia and in the US to give them preferential access and special cuddles and economic advantage, as well as the sponsoring of think tanks and universities, do you think it's gone too far to reverse?
Well, I think, living here in DC, I do think there's a bipartisan recognition of the challenge. The real difficult portion of that is the Chinese Communist Party has done such an incredible job of insinuating themselves in the political process. Many times you find yourself conflicted because you have a relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. Then you're trying to campaign as being tough on China, and then all of a sudden this relationship with the Chinese Communist Party comes, popping up. So, for example, we have a company in Arizona. It's a weather balloon company that uses the weather balloons to take pictures of the United States. It's recently been revealed that the company took investment from Tencent, which of course is a Chinese tech company. And the co-founder of the company is running for Senate in Arizona as a famous astronaut, Scott Kelly. Who would have known that, an astronaut hero would be the co-founder of a company taking money from the Chinese Communist Party? And so now, I'm sure that he would love to be counter to the Chinese Communist Party, but then the question remains is, why did you take money from them? And this,
I think it's because the money
problems with like Biden and others. And so it is bipartisan, but if you've been, if you're anybody of any kind of stature in the United States, they've tried to come and co-opt you. And I'm of the opinion that we just say, we have what's the term I'm looking for? We have we basically tell people that we're going to, everybody, and this is what I said in the White House, by the way, we're all culpable. There's no way that we can look to each other and say, well, you're more culpable. We're all culpable. And so I think you almost need to reset and say, okay, from here on out, we're just not going to allow this kind of behavior. Otherwise, they've done such a good job of insinuating themselves in the political process that nearly everybody that's got, aspirations for political position has been co-opted.
Yeah, and so, things like companies like Tencent, I don't think are understood as being instruments of the Chinese Communist Party, but that's because in the West we believe that private companies are private, but it is true that Chinese companies are never private companies.
That's the nature of the system. The Chinese Communist Party has when we think of citizens of America or citizens of Australia, they're truly citizens. If you're a citizen of China, you're not a citizen. You're a subject of the Chinese Communist Party. You're there for them to do with as they will. That is their system. And it's very difficult to understand, and particularly because they have the People's Republic of China, they can say, well, you're a citizen of China. Well, you're not a citizen of China. You're a subject of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So, General, for our listeners who operate, largely small to medium-sized businesses, I guess the advice I've been giving is that it's silly for a company or a country to have its supply chain controlled by anyone, be that the Chinese Communist Party or anything. Diversification in your supply chain makes sense. What are some of the things that you think are, at a grassroots level, Australian businesses can be doing to level the playing field, if you like, and inoculate themselves from the Chinese Communist Party's behavior?
Yeah, so really it's the government has to get involved in a more proactive way. It's a whole of a nation effort on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party to destroy business outside of China. And so using funds to incentivize onshoring of manufacturing. You cannot compete with the Chinese. It's not a fair competition. So the government of Australia, just like the government of the United States, has to become much more proactive in kind of making the kind of changes, policy changes, incentive changes that actually promote business, at least for a time until we can get past this, excessive infiltration of China, and we can begin to strengthen our ties with other democracies and countries that play by the rules, that we can begin to grow our system. I'm very much an advocate of using, in the United States, our defense budget, which is almost $800 billion a year, to help incentivize those companies to reshore manufacturing, to build infrastructure, to do science and technology research and STEM education. And as you begin to move those dollars out of buying weapons, a lot of the weapons, by the way, the components are made in China, and you start to stimulate really business, industrial type business, then you're going to see some economic growth out of that. The other thing, the imperative thing, is to secure the digital domain of a democracy. And so when we wrote in the national security strategy, we're going to build a nationwide secure 5G network. It was recognizing the strategic nature, as a resource of data in the 21st century, the importance of data in the information economy, and the fact that, our telecommunication systems were completely vulnerable to the Chinese and were under attack. Now, we tend to think of the domain of the government to protect, government data. No, it is the responsibility of the government of a free society to protect everybody's data, because that, by the way, is the most valuable resource. It's like oil in the 20th century, but we haven't got to this point. We have air forces, armies, Space Force and navies, but we haven't yet realized that the most important domain to protect is the digital domain. So I think that's where I would really, focus my energy as a government in Australia.
And I guess to conclude, General, is there any chance in your view of kinetic conflict in the next 5 years between I guess the Chinese Communist Party and either anyone or the Western Alliance or the US?
I don't believe so. I think, we had a fundamental shift in the nature of conflict after the invention of nuclear weapons. It's something that we can't go back on. It's far too terrible to think about, conflict between nuclear armed opponents. And so that's when, war really went, sideways in a ways. And the Chinese really took that to its next level and really perfected it. The Soviet Union, we're spending 40% of GDP on guns. The Chinese only spend, less than 2%. And then they spend all their money on driving their economic dominance. The thing that we haven't figured out is, we are in essentially today the position that we put the Soviets in. When the Cold War ended, it wasn't because of weapons that were fired. It was because the Soviet Union was bankrupt. There were people literally starving. I remember a friend of mine going to Ukraine at the end of the Cold War and really helping the Soviet Navy scrap their ships and sell the metal for food because they were they and their families were starving. So that's what, as I came into the Pentagon in 2014, that's what I realized we face. We're not going to get bombed. We're going to get broke, and we're going to park our ships and planes, and we're going to be, essentially, demoted to a third world economy because, all the advanced systems had gone to China. So no, I don't believe we're going to have a kinetic war. And more importantly, that's why things like nuclear weapons in the United States exist to prevent that type of escalation. So
can the ship be turned around, if you like? Can the dynamism of the US be harnessed and across Western democracies to identify, I guess, the threat and respond, I guess, overwhelmingly economically to tilt, to tilt the playing field back to either level or the other way? Yes, and the answer is really protect the digital domain, ensure the innovation, technology, talent, and capital of free societies go to free societies. If you do that, you're going to see a profound change in the international order. Authoritarian systems don't work. We know they don't work. It's only when they have access to those things that they work. That's why we had COCOM during the Cold War. We prevented those things from going to the Soviet Union. Eventually it collapsed. Unfortunately, we thought that we'll do the different strategy with the Chinese and we'll grow them into democracy. No, you can't grow an authoritarian regime into democracy. They'll just take everything they can and they'll increase their power and then their prestige. And so now, is it your view that there'll be a hard decoupling? I think we're already on the way to decoupling. And the farther you go into decoupling, the faster it accelerates because the more determined the Chinese Communist Party is to exact retribution for the United States and other democracies protecting themselves. How dare they protect themselves? It is our right to have access to your markets and to your people and to your universities and to your technology and to your digital space. How dare you prevent us? You're trying to keep us down. That's the attitude of the Chinese Communist Party. And therefore, when you do try to protect yourself, they end up lashing out, which ends up accelerating the process. So that it's more obvious what's going on, I guess. Right. And with the pandemic, how from Australia, we've got a bit of a flare up in Victoria, one of our states at the moment. We read all the news as to what's happening in the US. How does the US respond to the pandemic? It looks like with an interconnected world, you were there with SARS in, I think, 2002. So this is kind of becoming, I guess, a little bit more normalized. Does that increase the US's willingness to protect itself, decouple, and start again, or does it make China stronger?
Well, I think so. First of all, how the Chinese behaved. First, they spread the pandemic. There is no doubt about it. They knew about human-to-human transmission, and yet they encouraged travel, international travel from Wuhan. They did that. Xi Jinping himself, by his own words, was in charge on the 7th of January. They knew that there was human-to-human transmission, yet they allowed people to travel anyway and encouraged them. At the same time, they were locking down PPE and masks, not just in China, but all around the world, and become nearly overnight, go from a net exporter of PPE and masks to a net importer. So if you look at the timeline and you realize the actions the government took, they were trying to gain an advantage by an outbreak that they saw spreading from Wuhan. So what does that mean for the rest of us? Well, we recognize that what they are, but at the same time, horribly, tragically, in the United States, we're going through an election season. And so what is the certainty surrounding the election season? That is anything and everything is political. And therefore the coronavirus is political. And the way the president, the current president, was looking to be cruising into a second term, the reason was because of the tremendous accomplishments of the economy. Now, it was beginning to slow because we hadn't really started reshoring manufacturing or done investment in infrastructure. Nevertheless, today, I think there's an effort to keep the country continually closed. Now, when you look at the data of coronavirus, the deaths, the fatalities from it, don't exceed by very much the common flu. It's most damaging to those elderly or with health conditions, but the rest of us, I had coronavirus in January, came through it just fine. Most people do come through it just fine, but it's essentially created this pandemic fear in the United States that has us going through these cyclings of kind of relaxation of rules and then a tightening of rules. I think that's going to continue through November, and not until after the election will we see kind of a return to normal, a return to sanity when people realize that they're not going to die. Not everybody's going to die. It's not the data that's come out. And if it was, we would have seen millions of people already in the United States perish, and that's just not what we've seen. And in fact, I would say that probably some of the numbers, even though they're up around 130,000, are inflated and have been exacerbated by policy decisions like sending COVID positive patients to nursing homes in certain states. So it's an entirely tragic, process of a democratic system, but it's still, unfortunately, the best system we have.
Better than the alternative. I've really enjoyed our discussion. I'm sure that for our listeners who tune in, they'll benefit enormously from your perspective. Could keep you here for hours on a Saturday morning, but really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us, General. I'd love to catch up with you again as things in the US develop. As an Australian, we've got long and strong ties with the US, and I think it's incumbent of us here and there to share the importance of relationships around the world with people that share our ideals. So thank you.
Certainly, that's the way we protect them. Certainly.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Be Better Off Show. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to rate and review on Apple Podcasts.
Have a great day.